We're live. Welcome to the Institute for Liberal Values, January Liberalism in Practice panel discussion. We have with us today Brandy Shufutinsky, who is the Director of Education for the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. We have Naya Lecht, who's a research fellow, with the Institute for the Studies of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. We are expecting Jake Mackey, who is a professor at Occidental College and a co-founder of Free Black Thought, to join us. And we are missing today our friend Dana Stengel-Plow with a family issue. So that's okay because, here comes Jake now. But the three of us are pretty good at having this conversation on teachers. It's not the first time for us. So what we're doing is we're recreating something that we did at the Coalition for Empowered Education. At this conference, we brought together members of the coalition, which includes Institute for Liberal Values, JILV, the Jewish Institute, and Free Black Thought, to discuss and how we can depoliticize the classroom. So this is a redo, if you will, of a panel discussion, depoliticizing the classroom, the role of the teacher. So I gave very short intros. I know our time is short today. Jake, I know you've got to leave at 45 after. You're already in the car ready to go get your daughter. So that is great. For our audience, you can type in your questions into either ILV's YouTube or ILV's X, and we'll be able to answer them here live, and I'll keep some time for that to go. So I want to start quickly with the very first question, which is, what is the role of teachers? I mean, it seems to be that's constantly a question that people are answering. I know part of it is personal, but there should be a standard, right? So what is the role of teachers? Naya, I'm going to go with you first on this question.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks for having all of us here. To answer, I mean, I can't give you a straight answer because it depends teacher for what level, for what grade level, elementary, middle, high school, and then higher education. I think while there are certain things that remain, I think that depending on who you're teaching, the role of the teacher will then kind of evolve. What I mean by this is, for instance, in high school, so I'm not talking about higher education. In high school, what we're seeing, or what I'm seeing, is a lot of skill-based learning that's lacking. So for instance, reading comprehension, the ability to write a cogent sentence, grammar, these things that are not really highfalutin and, theoretical, but at the end of the day, it's really important that we, produce citizens that are able not just to be consumers of information, but to be able to then have output, so articulate a position, articulate something in writing. And so something that I've been seeing alarmingly is kind of the lack of skill-based education. So I really think that the role of the teacher, in addition to not indoctrinating, in addition to staying away from politicizing his or her classroom, I think that when we're talking about the younger grades, elementary, middle, and high school, I really do think that a teacher needs to remember that they are, still kind of shaping and forming young minds, but young minds to be able to do something. And that doing is really missing, which is writing and reading. And that's what I think the role of the teacher right now is, really to kind of hone in on that skill-based learning.
Jake, what about you? I know you're at the university level, but in general, what is the role of the teacher?
I teach at the college level, but I have two kids in K through 12, and so these issues are very close to me, Well, I completely agree with what Naya said, that, we have a sort of crisis in this country of just numeracy and literacy, How can we begin to think about all these more high-flown, abstract, theoretical things when we're producing, kids who can't read and can't do math? I mean, I was just listening to the latest Free Black Thought podcast. Connie interviewed Ian Rowe, who runs charter schools in New York City. And he said there's parts of the Bronx, where only 7% of students graduate high school ready to go to college. That's insane. Like, the first concern with them is not whether they're being indoctrinated, but whether they can read, write, and do math. So I agree 100%. But can I say a little further on this?
Please. Yeah.
So, okay, so let me sort of frame this by saying this. I do think this panel is called Depoliticizing Education. I do think education is inherently political. You know, polities, political communities institute educational institutions um, not in order to transmit some kind of purely objective, neutral, abstract set of sort of facts or something, but in order to perpetuate the norms of their own political community. You know, at some level, education has to do that and always has. And so what we're worried about here is a certain kind of very left-wing, very disruptive kind of politicization. But I would say that teachers, you know, do bear a kind of responsibility for making students aware of the kind of polity in which they live and for communicating the fundamental basic values of that polity. You know, we live in a liberal democratic republic, and teachers that should be part of the curriculum. I think that not in a rah-rah jingoistic, you know, USA kind of way, but just what kind of country do we live in? What are the fundamental underlying norms and values, and why are they worth preserving, endorsing, you know, honoring? So I'll
So
say
I have
that
to.
teachers, that's a fundamental role of the teacher, I think.
Would you call that civics?
Yeah. In a word, yeah, teachers are responsible for teaching civics. Yeah.
Civics and citizen development, I would say.
Hmm. And that's political, you know, that's part of living in a
Mhm.
polity. So, yeah.
Brandy, do you want to respond to that? And if not, give us what your idea of the role of the teacher is and any problems that you're seeing today.
I mean, I think at first the role of the teacher is to give kids tools necessary so that they can learn and grow. We've gotten into a lot of conversations and debates about and concern over students not having critical thinking skills. So immediately there are people pushing like, oh, we need to teach kids critical thinking, and they're skipping a couple of steps. Kids can't develop critical thinking without foundational knowledge. And so depending again on grade level, like you look at elementary school, middle school, high school, and then higher ed, there are different levels to that. But how can we ask kids to critically think about something and they have no idea, like they have zero foundational knowledge? And that's a lot of what we're seeing. And so to me, one of the main goals of a teacher is to teach kids to be literate. Without literacy, we have nothing as far as civilization. I think that's foundational, and we can see now as more and more teachers think that it is their job to bring politics into the classroom as far as ideology. Literacy rates are plummeting. So gains that have been made over the past 3 decades, we're seeing those fall apart because kids are actually going through elementary school, middle school, and graduating high school functionally illiterate and innumerate.
And that literacy, I think, comes from, I mean, there's some strict rules around teaching just reading and writing. And I think partly some of our teachers kind of skip those steps to teach more to less the reading and writing and more what we would call like indoctrination. Is that what you're seeing? Is that one of the reasons why we've missed this skill building?
Partially, but I mean,
Naya, please.
No, go ahead, Brandy.
No, just partially there's that part about actually being literate, being able to read a passage, a book, a chapter, an essay, an article. But literacy also means being literate in the foundations of the democratic republic in which we live. So we'll hear activists say we need to critique our democracy, we need to critique capitalism, but without giving the students the foundational knowledge to what those systems mean, there is nothing. There isn't critique. That's indoctrination. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Naya.
No, I completely agree. And again, I want to bring it down from the high order thinking to, again, back to that skill-based learning. And that is, you know, I've been now part of a lot of different conversations with different teachers, especially in middle school. And what they're telling me is, for instance, they read books with their kids in order to quote unquote exercise an empathy muscle, right? They're not reading literature. First of all, they're not reading great books. Let's put it this way. They're reading books that, check off certain, again, political boxes like identity politics, even class-based identity, gender-based identity, right? And they say it with their, it's not something I'm making up. They really believe that the goal is for these kids to exercise their empathy muscles. These are not my words. These are words that I've been hearing. And so it makes sense that we and Jake, who's in higher education, is now they're grandfathering in, if you will, students who are they cannot identify subjects and sentences. So they can't really read a complicated text anymore because they've been effectively doing, maybe we'll get to this conversation later, but it's like SEL. They're using literature for SEL purposes, which is social emotional learning. They're just now using literature, and now they're not even reading great books as well. So that really is really alarming to me, is that the teacher sees his or herself as this priest or priestess whose goal is to create empathetic citizens. And I don't think that's what Jake is talking about when he says, being aware as citizens and polity, not empathy, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. And can I add to that what Naya just said? So I saw something like this with my own daughter in maybe second grade. Her teacher had a color, a wheel of skin tone colors on the wall, and the classroom was very much it was all about noticing the different skin tones of all the people in the class and appreciating that and all this stuff. And this sort of took precedence over these fundamental skills that Naya's talking about. And here's an example. My daughter was given a picture book with words by maybe my mother, her grandmother, for Christmas or something. And she opened it up, sort of flipped through it, and then was like, nah, I don't like this one. And I was like, why? You haven't even tried to read it yet. And she was like, there's not enough different skin colors in it. And so the idea that the criterion by which you would accept or reject a book or any other kind of cultural product is based on, is there enough representation of this, that, or the other thing in it? She wasn't taught to read the sentences, understand the plot. What's motivating the characters? What is the conflict that the characters face? How do they resolve it? No, it's you look real quick. If there's not enough skin tones, you reject it. That is a fundamental sort of failure of education, I think, and I do think that it sort of stands as a kind of, it's emblematic of what's going on, I think, in a lot of teaching.
Well, this brings up, I'm going to add a corollary to this question. And someone in the comments mentioned this as well. When we talk about social and emotional learning, this is kind of part two of this question. What is the role of the teacher? Is the role of the teacher social and emotional learning? Is it teaching them these kind of values outside of, again, and I wouldn't say that this is value teaching, but outside of instilling some understanding of the Constitution, understanding of civics, to the extent that civics overlaps with values, civility, and there's some civic virtue. Is there this need, particularly I'd say in K through 12 and even more elementary school, to teach empathy? Is that something that schools should be responsible for? I leave that open to any of you.
I'll wait.
So I'll say I'm going to jump in for a minute. I think that there's a responsibility for a teacher to create healthy social norms in a classroom. I don't know that means there needs to be entire programs like what's happened with social emotional learning, and have that kind of dictate everything that goes on in a classroom. A social norm that I think most of us learned in the classroom is you wait your turn, you stand in line, you raise your hand. You apologize if you bump a kid or hit a kid, like that type of stuff is going to happen in a classroom because a teacher is there with a couple dozen kids. I believe that should happen. Anyone who's managed a classroom does those things, like those little things that could be social emotional learning. Kids are learning to wait, to patience. They're learning that they can't have everything they want exactly when they have it. They're in a classroom with dozens of other kids. That's pretty much, in my opinion, the extent of what a teacher should do to manage a classroom and to encourage, whether it's empathy or critical thinking or civility, whatever you want to call it. That kind of sums it up. And I'm sure most of us, or maybe all four of us, kind of had that when we went to school. We had to wait in line. We had to, say the Pledge of Allegiance. You have to ask to go to the restroom, the norms.
If I may add to that, empathy is a very different thing than reading and writing. Reading and writing and doing math actually they're not developmentally natural to human beings. In other words, so if you just sort of fed a person and, gave them plenty of fresh air and let them run around, they'll grow up, they'll go through their puberty, etc. Their hair will grow, they'll develop bigger muscles, whatever, but they won't necessarily learn to read, write, and do math unless they're explicitly instructed. Well, I think empathy is kind of like, puberty. It's something we're biologically endowed with, except for the maybe whatever the figure is, 7 to 10% of people who are psychopaths. Empathy is a fundamental great ape emotion, and it does need to be trained and brought out. It's not going to just completely take care of itself, but it is something that is developmentally natural, and I don't think there needs to be a whole special SEL structure around it. I think my understanding is the SEL thing has not been shown to be particularly effective in developing these just normal human sort of, empathy, kindness, etc. I don't think it really helps much. And like Brandy said, I think, good teachers, I don't know how they're taught to do this, but I think good teachers help bring that out of children. And my kids have had good teachers who've helped them with that. And I don't think it's probably not rocket science. It's probably stuff like, now, why did you hit Timmy? How would you feel if Timmy hit you? Let's go talk to Timmy and apologize. Things like that. But maybe here I'm showing my ignorance of early childhood education. But I do think empathy is fundamentally different than these taught skills that are not developmentally natural. They're acquired.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say two things, and I'll try to keep it brief and bring us back again to kind of more, basic things. And that is to the person who asked that question. As somebody who works in the classroom, you have X amount of hours in the day, right? And if you're going to take the time to do empathy at the expense of literacy or numeracy, that's it. That's just how you cut. There's no way to cut this in any cloth any other way, right? If you have, 6 hours in the day with your students, and let's say you are mandated to do SEL in the 4th grade for X amount of hours, that is a detriment to your curriculum where you are so that's just very basic, understanding. The second thing is, I too, like Jake, I'm not really well versed in elementary education, so K through 8th grade, right? But I will say, I used to teach in university. I've shifted now towards high school. And I can't say this is a blanket statement as all high school students, but working with various high school students, both in public and private schools, I will say that particularly in teaching charged topics like the Arab-Israeli conflict, what I'm getting is students who probably were taught an empathy that is very, very harmful, almost like a suicidal empathy, if you will, where you only empathize with a particular profile. You empathize with the underdog, and you not only that, you allow the underdog to get away with effectively crimes against humanity because they are the underdog. And so what I've inherited in senior year in high schools is students, and mostly from public schools I'm talking right now, they're at a deficit in terms of how they are navigating charged conversations around for me, it's what I teach is the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so it's hard to penetrate their moral kind of framework because they've been taught a certain way to empathize in a certain type of way. So that's the other problem.
I'm glad you brought that up. So I'm a social worker by trade. And at most of my professional life and working in social work has been working with victims and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And empathy is an emotion that gets manipulated by an abuser. Feel sorry for me so they can continue to abuse. And that's when you get into, Naya, what you mentioned, is suicidal empathy. So, I mean, it's an easily manipulated emotion. So thinking, well, do you actually want your 8-year-old or 12-year-old or 15-year-old being taught to always that empathy is the number one emotion that makes them the most virtuous person, when they could be potentially led to empathize with somebody who is ill-intentioned. Right. And who's an abuser. I think that that's something that maybe it's an unintended consequence of this whole push for social emotional learning. But as a social worker, it's also a little bit concerning that teachers who aren't necessarily actually trained or licensed in mental health and behavioral health being tasked with doing something that they don't necessarily have the skill set to do and can easily cause more harm than good.
You know, Jill makes a good comment here. She said that empathy can be taught on the playground and in gym. And I hadn't thought about that, but that is a good, I mean, you can still be at school, you can still do the, and I don't know if that's, I mean, it is empathy, but it's general, like, again, civility and courtesy and connection. And I think that, yeah, you can still do it at school, but the playground and the gym are really good places for empathy, really, maybe not in your math class or your reading class per se, although I think that is important. But let's carry on with this idea of, one of the questions we asked was, how can teachers create a healthy culture, so, of inquiry and viewpoint diversity in the classroom? And I think when we talk about inquiry and viewpoint diversity, we're building in empathy into that. But I think that this kind of touches on what all three of you have said, is that certain ways things are taught without inquiry or viewpoint diversity actually stunts empathy, or at least it stunts it towards certain groups or certain people. So what are you thinking about that? How would you respond to a healthy culture of inquiry? Are we doing it? And if not, how do we do it?
Yeah, I could go first
Yeah.
and just offer one thought, and it's something that we in Free Black Thought have thought of using some of our resources for. We have this huge bibliography of Black authors that we call the Compendium of Free Black Thought, and we've thought of using that to create curricula where we put the authors in dialogue and create lesson plans where you read some Du Bois, but then you read some Booker T. Washington as a counterpoint, and then you read some Carey Miller, who tries to sort of triangulate between the three of them. And I think if you do that, you teach students in that way, teach them to be open to the fact that there's always going to be multiple perspectives on any given question, topic, issue. Teach them to be charitable towards these different viewpoints. Help them, don't tell them which one to pick, but help them learn how to come to their own conclusions when faced with multiple conflicting viewpoints. I think that's a pretty straightforward way that teachers could build healthy, classrooms with a sort of spirit of free inquiry in them. Yeah.
I think that it's a big question, but I think that, and I think Jake referenced this a bit right now, and he kept on using the word inquiry. I think that students are often the ones answering questions, and I think we need to teach them to ask questions. And so a lot of times in my class, I will reverse and ask them, we're reading something. Okay, you pose the question to the text. What is your question? And the fact of the matter, because I think it's so important for them to learn to be, inquirers to get to some sort of truth. And then Dana, who's not here with us, but last time at this very panel that we did in Sacramento, she said something, and I just want to pay her I want to first of all reference her. I mean, it's her idea that she said, which is modeling changing your mind for your students. I remember we had that, and it really, really inspired me to teach students to be. It's okay to be wrong, and it's okay to, because of your inquiry, think, perhaps I was wrong about my assessment of this axiom or of this particular conflict within story. I think when you model that humility, but also the fact of the matter that, the more you inquire, the more you arrive to certain truth. I think that's great.
I think in order to do that, we have to have teachers that are willing to give students the space to ask the questions. We have to have teachers that are going to be willing to bring in perspectives that are diverse and sometimes in conflict with one another. So one of the unfortunate things we're seeing is not that. We're seeing materials brought into the classroom to lead students to a specific conclusion, which really just kills curiosity and inquiry. It kills it. It stifles it. It doesn't allow it to grow and flourish. Anyone who's worked with or has children knows they ask a million questions. I mean, kids are naturally curious. They need the space to be able to do that. And if we don't have educators that are willing to allow those types of questions and conversations and sometimes debate happen, then I think we're going to continue to see more ignorance, learned ignorance, and stifled communication and self-censorship on the side of students.
I kind of had a light bulb moment, Jake, when you mentioned you come with some of the work and the dialogue that you're doing between like Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, because I love that stuff, and I love the back and forth. And it kind of struck me, viewpoint diversity is empathy. So teaching these, teaching in this way, where you're taking two points of view in an English class, obviously this probably wouldn't work in math, but where you're taking two different authors and you're still teaching, basic literacy, but that have two different views, and having that discussion, and then Naya, to your point, and Brandy, to your point, having the students ask questions around that and ask each other questions around that. I mean, that is empathy. So, I mean, we could do SEL in such a much more constructive way than the way it's been done. And that brings me to then my next question. I think we've kind of answered that some teachers and some teaching has turned into indoctrination. Let's backtrack a little bit. Like, why? What has happened? I feel like in my classroom when I was growing up, I don't feel like we're seeing what we're seeing in the classroom now. So what was kind of the sea change where we're seeing more of this indoctrination in particularly K through 12 classrooms?
I think it goes back to your first question, the role of the teacher. I really do think that there was a shift in what, not everybody, obviously, but what some folks believed a teacher is supposed to do, where people would take, Jake, what you said, that education is political, and they took that to mean that it's should be politicized, which is a completely different viewpoint. But if a future teacher is taught in their program, and their undergraduate program and their teacher's college, that it is their job to bestow virtue on students by leading them to a specific conclusion, then we're going to get more of what the negative stuff that we're seeing in K-12 education. If a teacher is taught and trained that they're supposed to be creating, giving students foundational knowledge, supporting and encouraging inquiry and curiosity that will build until the student can mature and actually critically think about certain subjects, then we're going to get a different result. So, I mean, I really do think that the root is there are some people who think that the classroom is supposed to be politicized, that that's their very role.
Yeah, I think what happened, I mean, one of the things that happened is people sort of woke up to the fact that education is by its nature going to have it's going to have a political. It has some political content, and it's going to have it has a political purpose to sort of make citizens that um, that endorse the values of the political community in which they live, and so they said, well, look, if education is going to be political anyway, we might as well make it emancipatory, you know. And then and then I think there was a lot of I haven't done a full history of this myself, but I think there were a lot of converging strands. You had of course, in the 60s when college students sort of radicalized a lot, right? You get boomers then coming out of the sort of 60s new left uh, college experience, moving, and some of them moving into classrooms with um, that kind of political leaning. You also have Paulo Freire, right, becoming extremely popular, and the pedagogy of the oppressed becoming extremely popular with teachers. And some readings of that book, you're supposed to sort of help. Part of education is helping students recognize their own oppression. And there's different. I've talked to different people who have very different readings of Freire, but that's often how he's taken to be read, and so that's a very different model of education than like civics, right? Teaching them to learn how oppressed they are, and then in order to emancipate them, is very different than sort of socializing them into the political community of which they are a part. So yeah.
I agree with what was both what Brandy and Jake just said. I think I would urge us even to go deeper and ask, but why? Why did these teacher colleges, why did these programs become these centers for teaching Paulo Freire? Why? What were the reasons? And I don't know if I have the answer, but this is where I'm at right now. I think, people, mankind in general, they search to be good. People want to be good. People want to be virtuous, and people want to have purpose in life. And what an amazing purpose it is. I mean, I'm being kind of facetious with mine. What an amazing purpose it is to be standing at the pulpit of a classroom and creating virtuous people full of empathy. So I understand the impulse. And I understand even from a human psychological perspective that, people seek meaning and people seek purpose. And if you understand, wow, I'm a teacher, I'm going to liberate these minds. I'm going to teach them that their job is to emancipate and push up and decenter that narrative, the hegemony narrative, right? I'm going to do all that. It's very empowering and it's very enticing to a teacher, because these classrooms, I'm saying this tongue in cheek, but I'm also quite alarmed. I think these classrooms have become in many ways like churches, places where people are shaping, instead of where we started off today, what, like Randy said, what should the role of the teacher be? Is before we get to higher order thinking, right? Skill-based, they believe that their goal, their purpose is to create virtuous citizens of the world. And I just don't think that that's the purpose of a teacher. Maybe a priest, maybe a rabbi, maybe the parents.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, and virtue is so relative too. So again, that's, should teachers be bringing these ideas into the classroom? What's virtuous for one may not be virtuous for another, which I think that's different than the empathy. I think everyone can have empathy, but virtues and values often differ quite extensively. So for our audience, if you're a parent, how can you identify if your student is being educated versus indoctrinated? Like, what are kind of the telltale signs that would allow you to go, oh, okay, this is, get you involved?
I think one of them is just looking at what are they doing? What are they learning? Part of this is, I think we touched on it a little bit, but not just the purpose or the role of a teacher, but the purpose of schooling is scholarship. So, and I think that that's relatively easy to find and easily identified, but looking at what are they actually learning? So we can look at some of the worst curricula that many of us have been spending a lot of time kind of combating and uncovering. And if you look at it, if you read through it, if you look at the questions that are asked in the lessons, it's easily identified that there actually isn't any scholarship there. It's completely ideological. So looking at that, and then asking also, what aren't they learning? What aren't they reading? What history are they not being taught? When they're being told things like the United States was founded on genocide or white supremacy or any of these things, are they actually investigating the foundational texts and history of the country? Or are they being presented with some other material that leads to that answer, that outcome? And people can have different opinions on that, but what material are they being presented to come to that conclusion?
Absolutely. I mean, yes, to everything Brandy just said. Again, it's good. It goes back to that simple, what did you learn today? You know, that question, what'd you do in school today? Parents have to also own it. Parents can't just outsource, you know, the well-being of their kids to different organizations and different, I don't know, watchdog groups. I think that parents need to play an active role. I did, you know, and I continue to, when we lived in California, my son attended a public school, and in 4th grade, you know, I always asked, what are you doing? What are you reading? And he told me that he said in his classroom, the teacher said to the students, sometimes you have to be unfair to some in order to be fair to others. And that right away, I know my antennas went off, and I said, well, tell me more. What was the class really about? Well, it was a class about, it was a social justice class, a class about redistribution of goods, if you will, or what you would call redistribution of wealth, taught, you know, just for a 4th grade level class. So again, it's like asking, what did you do today? What are you reading? Can I see what the homework is? You know, being an invested parent.
There is the problem that we've seen, though, where a lot of the actual curricula is purposely hid. It's not transparent what is being taught. So outside of the asking questions, which is fundamental, and I think we all should be doing it, when you've got curricula that you can't see, I think that would be a big red flag right there as well.
Absolutely.
So we've seen late.
Are you able to hear me? I'm still hearing with an audio. I just had to. That's an often attributed the sort of big around CRT is often attributed to the fact that in the pandemic, parents finally to see what the kids were being taught, you know, because they're at home on the laptop or iPad, and that's that. I mean, it's absolutely it's very just flip through your kids the readings they're being given and see and you can learn the names of some of the that are sort of biased curricula, like Pollyanna is one. Obviously, Black Lives Matter curriculum. Obviously, the 1619 curriculum. You know, learn the names of the ones that are sort of purveying one-sided ideological lessons, and look for that.
So a lot in the news has been around the fact that DEI is dead. You know, we've seen a lot of not necessarily schools, but a lot of corporations, you know, throw away their DEI programs. And a lot of what we see in schools with the SEL, with what Jake, you were just talking about, Black Lives Matter curriculum, that, you know, DEI filtered into schools in various ways. So my question for you is DEI dead?
Well, the Department of Education just ended all of their DEI initiatives and programs today. So I think there are a lot of people that want DEI to die that are probably getting really excited about that. I want to say slow down the celebrations for a minute, for the people that want it to go away, because an ideology doesn't go away that easily. And also, I come from the perspective that when people are talking about DEI, what is it they're exactly talking about? We've had some form of diversity and inclusion for a number of decades. It just used to sit in human resources. So I think that it's easy to, get onto the sloganeering about DEI should die or DEI is great without actually getting to the meat of what is it you're talking about. But I think as far as K through 12 education is concerned, at least higher ed, there's maybe a little more wiggle room. I'm going to go back to what Naya said kind of in the beginning of this. You have limited time, you have limited resources. What do you want your kid to be doing and learning at school? How to read, write, the foundations of our democratic republic, how to do some experiments in science class? Or do you what do you want them to be doing with that 6, 7, 8 hours that they're in school?
If I could jump in, I have no idea about the answer to that question. I suspect that there's a lot of people who are going to be committed to continuing it in some kind of sneaky way. But we have a great, I think it's a great article that we co-wrote at the Journal of Free Black Thought, called Six Unsettling Features of DEI in K through 12. And I think the reason it could be useful for parents is that it, with a laser-like focus, identifies these very disturbing DEI practices, 6 of them. And if you were to read, you would have a very clear idea of what to look for in your school, see if the really divisive stuff and the sort of hyper-racialization and all this stuff is still going on. Yeah. I can send you the link and you can put it in the show notes.
Yeah, I'll do that. And one of the things, Naya, you touched on this earlier, is I think that the language might change where they stop using the DEI. I mean, there's a little bit of subterfuge that is going to go on, but if the teachers are still using the Paulo Freire, if they're still using the Howard Zinn, what the teachers are teaching, whether or not they use the term DEI, and Brandy, I think this touches on what you were saying. I mean, it's the ideology. And so you can cancel DEI, you can cancel the DEI training in corporations, but the actual ideology that undergirded the whole DEI movement, I think is still very, very present in K through 12 education in the teacher space. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
I think it's going to be one of the last places, if it ever goes away completely, that we see it go away, will be K through 12 education. I think that they're going to hold on. People are going to hold on to it in that space for as long as possible. And the kind of pessimistic side of me, which is a big part, looks at it and thinks, it's a big moneymaker. It's been a huge moneymaker, and K through 12 education, and the hijacking of it, or is in the manipulation of it, has been a big moneymaker for a lot of folks, and it's just taxpayer dollars. And unfortunately, what we see is that the results don't have to be positive for the K-12 education system to keep doing the same thing. They can keep failing and keep getting paid a lot of money to keep failing.
There's a good article by Aaron Sabarium, that he's the journalist with what is it? Is it the Washington Times? Examiner, yeah. He has an interesting article where he traces a lot of this to the accrediting agencies. And so the accrediting agencies say, well, to get accredited, you have to have a certain number of these DEI practices. And gosh, I mean, I would hate to come review your school and not find them and have to take away your accreditation. and they have a kind of scratch deal with these companies like Pollyanna that I mentioned before. And so suddenly you have this to buy a Pollyanna curriculum, right? So yeah, I think the accreditation is going to have to change. The accrediting agencies are going to have to change, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. accreditation is probably too broad for this panel, but that is something that maybe we can come back on and talk about. I think that that's so important. I feel like if you were to change how teachers are credentialed, you might actually get really passionate people in there teaching, and it might actually change the face of education itself. I mean, I had this conversation recently about, people who have masters in subject areas could not come and be a teacher, even though they've got all the expertise to do so, and they love their subject area. There's that the kind of the hoops that each teacher has to go through, and that's where the teacher colleges come in, where those hoops happen to include Paulo Freire, Howard Zinn, and all these other documents and curricula that tend to activate activists, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's the accrediting agencies, and then there's also the ed schools. And Jen, that stuff you were just mentioning is like it's the Bible of ed schools, right? Lyle Asher has a couple of articles. I think one of them is called "What Happened to Education Schools," and he has a really good series of videos on Peter Boghossian's YouTube channel where he traces the history of exactly how education schools became sort of farms for producing radical teachers. And so that's another part of the puzzle. The accrediting agencies, the ed schools, it's not as simple as just dealing with the individual school. It goes so deep.
Right. Which is one of the reasons I've got to plug, when we all came together, the Coalition for Empowered Education now has teacher training that we're hoping eventually becomes foundational in the ed schools around everything that we're talking about here: critical thinking, civics, and understanding competing ideology. So I have to put a little plug there. And for our audience, everything that you said, Jake, including what I just said with this teacher training program, I will put in the notes for probably in the next 48 hours on ILB's YouTube. So those Siberia article, and also Lyle Asher, who's done fabulous work on this. He's the one who really opened my eyes up to that being, I think, the root of the problem. Mm-hmm. So let me ask a final question here. What is one piece of advice you could give to anyone concerned with the politicization of the classroom?
I just want to say, and this relates to one of the questions that somebody asked about, how do you question without being accused of or being called a racist? Don't worry about what you're going to be accused of. Ask anyway. I think that it is a parent's responsibility to know what's going on with their kids. And so one piece of advice is to ask anyway.
I want to second that. I did that. I went to the head of my kid's school and I presented a PowerPoint of some of the most disturbing practices that are happening around the country. And I explained why I found them disturbing and why I hoped I wouldn't find them in that school. And he was extremely receptive. And you might make a friend and an ally by doing that. Yeah.
I agree with Brandy wholeheartedly here. Really, continue asking, continue, probing. Especially if you're a parent, I'm a parent. It's my duty. I feel, nobody else can do this but me. So keep on asking that question. The other thing I want to say is I don't see the comments that people are leaving, but in case somebody does have this question. And I only raise this because my brother has 2 children in a private kind of elite school, prep school. And his concern and always worry is that if he does something, it'll backfire on his kids. And the teachers are going to exact their revenge, And what ends up a lot of times happening, and I'm just sharing in my family, is that my niece and nephew beg not for the parents not to get involved because they either are afraid the ramifications that will have socially, or that the teacher will have will come down on the grade. And I understand that concern, but I just, and it's something that my brother and I always talk about, but you're modeling something for your kid at that moment, because then what's next? In college, there's another hurdle. And then you're teaching your kid to stand up for himself or herself, to advocate. Yeah, there could be repercussions. Like Brandy was saying, okay, so you're going to get called a racist. Okay, maybe that's not as terrible as a concern about how will my pushing against the school affect what happens to my kid when I drop my child off for those 6 or so hours. I understand that, but you are modeling this kind of courage, resilience, and advocacy for your kids, for them to do that later on in life. You shouldn't feel beholden to the school to such a degree that you're afraid. But I get it, but I understand it. But I still think that we should push ourselves, because there's a bigger reward, as I'm saying again, the reward being you're modeling that courage for your kid.
And if any of us, and you're 100% right, Naya, the retaliation can actually be real. And I just want everybody to think about, if you're actually worried about retaliation against your child, do you want your kid at that school anyway? Because it sounds very, very similar to an abusive relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that this kind of goes to this as well, and there's a question here on how do we fight it. I mean, one of the things I would say is I think that there is groups like our own, the Coalition for Empowered Education, which you can find out more at empowered-ed.org. You can join our network, and so that you're not really alone. There are enough parents out there. There are enough people, 4 of us included, that you can contact. And we have our own networks where I don't think we have to kind of, at the early stages, the early stages of COVID, the early stages of a lot of the kind of the BLM movement, you were chastised if you spoke out. And I think now that we've got kind of a tipping point, if you will, of enough people that you need your own courage, but we can share some of that with you as well, so that you've got that backing. Let me see if there's we've got a question of, curious to hear about these concerning examples that Jake shared in the PowerPoint. Are you willing to share those?
Oh, sure. Let me just pull it up here. Okay, yeah. There was one example where Paul Rossi, a math teacher at, what was the name of the private school in New York City?
Really?
Was he at Brearley? Yeah, he was a math teacher, and they were doing some really radical DEI kind of programming with the kids, and he got the head of the school tape recording of the guy. He said to him, "It really seems like this DEI curriculum demonizes white kids, doesn't it?" And he said, "Yeah, we are demonizing white children." I mean, that was one example. There was another example, I think, in Virginia, of a woman a black woman whose kids they segregated. They created segregated classrooms, one classroom for white kids, one classroom for black kids. And she said, "You are not going to resegregate this school. You are not going to do this." And she I think took it to court and everything. And so there's these sort of somewhat shocking examples of things like that have happened. Yeah, another one would be in Cupertino, California. There were, I think, third graders who were taught, and these are mainly third graders of color. These are not even white kids. And they were taught that, and I quote, "They do not benefit from their social identities, and they have little to no privilege and power." That was an explicit teaching at this these third graders. I mean, that is child abuse, telling children they have no power and that they don't benefit from their social identities. So there's just some shocking examples out there. That's 3 of them.
And Jake, if you want to, if there's a link to your PowerPoint, I'll put that in the notes as well.
Yeah.
So we've got another question where, do we have any info about great high school curricula for public school subjects? one of the things I just want to again throw out there that we're eventually going to do with the coalition is kind of create a clearinghouse of excellence for various curricula that have, that promote liberal values, that people can go in and make suggestions to their schools that these are good curricula or know that these are solid curricula. But what do you have any ideas on where people would find this curricula now without having such a clearinghouse?
Well,
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I want to take a few steps back and say that somebody who I do a lot of work developing and also evaluating curriculum. And something that I've come a realization is that curriculum is about 30%. It's really who's in the class delivering that curriculum. So you can have an amazing curriculum, but if you have a teacher, again, from these schools who's been taught to think of herself or himself as again, priest or priestess, not going to work. And the other thing is, I'm so glad that you guys developing teacher training, because the curriculum without a teacher training, not great either. So it's really important. Whoever asked that question, you can bring amazing curriculum to a school, but if you don't have someone who's well-versed and capable in delivering that curriculum, that's the other problem. We need to create a new cadre of amazing educators.
Yeah. And part of that is accreditation. But I want to tell a story that I don't think one of our partners, Ken Pope with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, tells, and I think it's really powerful. So as you know, Florida is one of those states that they've already adopted standards to teach communism, et cetera. And he's helped Florida do this. So he has a class of, it's not a class, he's got the debate team, the Florida State debate team. So the brightest of the bright, obviously, hopefully also critical thinking, right? Debate, you would think that would employ critical thinking, comes to visit the Victims of Communism Memorial Museum in DC. And these debate kids, after a little presentation, just, for longer than the presentation, just kept on drilling him to try to find where there was some redeeming quality of socialism. And he asked later his Florida DOE counterpart, who he had been working on to create these standards around teaching, communism and socialism in history courses. And that's exactly what he said, Naya. He said, they're teaching it. They're teaching the communism and the socialism. I mean, they're checking the box, but it's how they teach it that makes all the difference in the world. Mm-hmm. And so here's some of the brightest students that Florida, produced, knowing communism, still fighting, or just searching for some kernel of truth that makes it the better system.
I think we need to look at what not just good curriculum, but look at what are the good schools, which schools are actually producing scholars. And we can look at, Jake, I want to see Connie's discussion with Ian Rowe, look and really identifying those schools and figuring out what is it that they're doing. How are they hiring teachers? How are they training teachers? How are they developing curriculum? Like, what is their school? How is their school operating? Because that's, I think, the key. It's not just one or the other.
Yeah. Ken corrects me in the comments here that it was 90 minutes that he was grilled on. So yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things too, talking about is DEI dead, right? Well, one of the things that we're seeing now with the new administration is a lot of legislators are now trying to do what Florida did and put in standards that teach communism and teach socialism. But again, where I don't think the new administration or really anyone outside of kind of our network here is thinking is it doesn't matter if the teachers are still being taught the same thing. So no one is really kind of addressing that. And I think that's the real problem. So, well, we are almost at time. Any final questions or final thoughts from the panel? Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Your knowledge helps us so much to navigate this thorny landscape. So we appreciate you. And again, for our audience, I will put all of these, including Jake's PowerPoint, who he just sent to me, in our YouTube with links in the next 24 to 48 hours. So big thank you to everyone. I've got a lot of thank yous here.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate everyone. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.